Hello, everyone. I was looking at some data this weekend just for my own interest, and I actually thought it'd be useful to share because there's a lot of focus at the moment on immigration, especially if we look at immigration coming into the UK. Everyone is questioning why aren't we stopping the small boats? Why are we taking so many immigrants in full stop? And I think we need to take a step back and look at the root challenge that is facing not only the UK. It's starting to become a global phenomenon as well, but it is very much a European problem as well. And this relates to, of course, the very low fertility rates that we have across European economies these days. And I've just come onto this site here, Worldometer, just to show you some of this data and how it fits together. We can see we've got the population of the United Kingdom, the years, the 5-year periods up until 2022. We have the yearly change, percentage change in the population, the actual numerical change, and the important part here, we have the net migration. And it's important to remember, of course, net migration is not the total of the migrants, it's the total of the migrants taking away those people who've also left the country. Now, I'm not 100% sure about the accuracy of this data. So, for example, if we look at 2024, the common knowledge in the UK is that there was around or net migration of at least 700 to 800,000 up until June 2024. And if we look at the official UK data, that the figure is actually slightly higher, probably 900,000 for net migration. And the important thing is that that means there are actually, closer to 1.3 million immigrants arriving in the country. So new people arriving in the country is actually 1.3, but after you take away the people who have left, you're left with the net migration being closer to 800,000. So it's a very big number. And the important point here is that this dynamic has only changed in recent years. And you can see that if we had not had this net migration figure here, we would have actually faced largely a stable to falling population already. So the net migration is basically holding up the population in the UK. And what is important here is to understand the replacement level fertility. And for developed nations, they argue that you need to have a level of about 2.1. Just to remind ourselves, if we go back here, you can see the figure in the UK at the moment is 1.54, so significantly below 2.1. And you actually have to go all the way back to 1970 to be above the 2.1 level. So this has been it's been a long time since we had the baby boom period, and we are now seeing a complete change in this trend. For countries, for developing countries where they may struggle with other aspects such as high child mortality rates, then mortality, sorry, we need to ensure that that replacement level is slightly higher. So that's important to understand as well. Now, clearly, the function for this is quite simple. If you're not having a fertility level above 2.1, then overall your population will be falling. That's the important thing. And the balancing part of this equation, if you have a falling population domestically, because you are below that 2.1 level, then the only way to supplement your population is by bringing in migrants. There is no other way to do it. So, you can ignore all the media uproar about migration and why we don't need it. The reality is we're not having enough children in Europe, to replace the population ourselves, so we need to supplement it with migrants. And this does not look as though it's a problem that is going to be resolved or changed in the coming years. And in the UK, we might say, well, why don't we just go to, take European people? Why do we have to go to, Africa, Middle East, to replace our population, for example? Well, the reality is that most of the countries around Europe are very much facing the same problem. We have Germany here, for example. You can see very low fertility rate, 1.46. And the last time, the population was as high, if we go all the way back to 1970, you can see when the fertility rate was closer to 2.1, the population was 78 million. So it hasn't changed significantly in 55 years, basically. And you can see that the net migration has been the saving foundation recently. And factually, if we look at it in 2010, we can see that the population had started to fall. The net migration number was not sufficient to actually support the population. So we were seeing a drop in the German population in 2010. So we can imagine that the government was sat there thinking, we've got a bit of a crisis. The population is falling quickly. We're not going to have enough people to take care of the elderly. We're not going to have enough people to do all the jobs we need. So you could argue that the unfortunate crisis we've seen in Syria around this period, 2015, did actually present the German government with the perfect opportunity to supplement the German population. So by deeming it, or by colouring it as a humanitarian operation, they were able to convince the population that a large number of migrants were necessary because of the humanitarian reasons. But the reality of the fact is they were maybe doing it because to prevent the population from falling. And we can see now, if you look at the 2025 data, so obviously in 2015 we had that very big increase in net migration. With the change in sentiment in Germany, as we've seen in other European countries, we are seeing a pushback on migration, and we may see that it actually becomes negative in terms of net migrants. And you can see that the consequence of this almost immediately is that we get a falling population. So we need to balance this discussion up, because Europe has to understand how it can survive with a low fertility rate and no net migration. That is going to be a challenge in itself. And the problem we have is that it's not only about the fertility rate. We, of course, have an aging population. And you can see that the European Central Bank deemed this important enough to do their own paper about in 2022. And I'm not going to go through all the details here, but they're worried about a lot of things, and obviously they're worried about the fiscal implications of an aging population. You need, of course, a workforce who can possibly take care of them. So going back to the fertility rate, if we have a falling population, but a greater demand from the elderly, that is obviously going to cause big problems in how you allocate labor, and if you have enough resources, for the manufacturing sectors as well. So there are a lot of issues here. The other issue is, of course, investments. If the population has gone from being saving for their pension retirement to spending, then it may have implications for stock market investment, because instead of saving every month for their pension, they may now be taking that money out and basically selling down positions. Not only that, but because they're drawing on their pensions from the state, the governments, many of which in Europe, merely have to find those tax revenues at the point the pension is needed. That is going to be a bigger draw on the governments and their finances as well. So if behind that you've got a shrinking working population who are less able to pay the taxes necessary to support that aging population, you can understand that there is a big problem, especially if you already have an economy which has a high level of debt that needs to be financed. So there are a lot of ramifications here. They also talk about the house prices. And from the perspective of an aging population, they don't seem to see that in itself as being a major problem. But of course, if we have a falling population, because we don't have that net migration remaining positive, that could have a bigger impact on housing prices, because clearly the amount of demand will fall quite significantly because there'll be less people. And given that we have had this cost of living crisis where the wealth in houses has possibly been utilized as a piggy bank to keep up with those higher costs, this would obviously be a huge problem if that wealth backbone is removed from the economy, and suddenly people don't have those assets to call on in order to finance that spending. So with the population becoming older, if you did have that coinciding with a falling house price environment because of a falling population and less people in the workforce, you can quickly understand that there would be some major fiscal pressures on government. So this is a big problem for Europe. It is a problem that may become a global problem, so more of a humanitarian problem, full stop, in the coming years. Of course, it may not all be bad, because if there's less people, there's less pollution. If things are cheaper, then maybe people can actually live a better lifestyle ultimately. But there may be a period where the rebalancing is quite painful for those people who do hold assets, which may decrease in value as a consequence. So interesting times ahead, but I think the most important point here is that if Europe wants to change or take control of its own direction, the main focus needs to be on addressing the fertility rate. And that may necessitate, for example, tax benefits to younger people to have families, subsidizing care groups for children, etc. And basically just making it easier for people to have children, and for the state to be more actively involved in pushing it, because as we can see now, children are clearly a future asset for an economy, and investment in children and the ability of parents to have them should be a key government policy. If it's not, then we all have to accept that migration will be a growing factor in the coming years, and it will lead to quite a dramatic shift in the makeup of the European population, because, as I say, we can't take Europeans from other European countries that are facing the same problem. So if we want to maintain populations without growing them ourselves through higher fertility rates, the only option is to take people from other continents, other cultures. But the problem we may face is that it's not going to be too long until they may encounter similar problems themselves as well. So a very interesting few years ahead of us, I think. Thank you for listening. Bye bye.